Kelly's come in, the Smithsonian, and certainly as a pathologist has added a lot of passion for her job.
Sorry, I haven't used one of these before. So as Dennis said, I'm Erin Latimer. I run the EEHV lab at the National Zoo. So I do most of the monitoring and diagnostics for the US. And because it's monitoring diagnostics, it's been mostly the Asian elephants because that's what we've seen it in. So I wanted to start out with just a couple slides of references, and these are all up on the EEHV info website. These are a lot of references for what's been done in African elephants, and it's a lot of people other than me. So I wanted to make sure that their names got up there. A lot of the stuff actually in Africa has been done by Virginia Pearson and Gary Hayward. Virginia's at Fox Chase and Gary's at Hopkins. And Virginia has a lot of colleagues in the African range countries. She's collected a lot of samples. So there's 2 pages of references, and they'll be in the PDF if you're interested in them, and they're also on the website. So in African elephants, EEHV is found in free-ranging elephants and also in human care in both the Asians and Africans, as Lauren said. Virginia has done extensive sampling in Kenya, South Africa, Botswana, and Gabon. And she found EEHV 2, 3A, 3B, 6A, 6B, and 7 in all of them, except in Gabon, no EEHV 2 has been found so far. So it's pretty ubiquitous within the African elephants. And a little bit of stuff that we had done in the US before this year, we also were seeing the same kind of thing. Pretty ubiquitous in them in the lung and skin nodules. And they also have a lot of gamma herpes viruses. So I like this slide. It's all of the EEHVs. The ones in red are the African ones. So you can see, we see HD, viremias, trunk shedding, saliva, nodules from all of the African EEHVs, except we don't see, so far have not seen disease or death due to EEHV 7. But all the other ones cause disease, death, lots of shedding. And then in black, it's the Asian EEHVs. And the interesting thing is with them, we do see all the disease and death. We haven't seen the lung and skin nodules in Asian elephants so far. And then with the gammas, there's a bunch of gammas, 1 through 5, A and B versions of each, and they're found in Asians and Africans. There's a picture of a nodule. They tend not to cause disease, so we're not so much worried about them, but they are out there. So before this year, we did see some hemorrhagic disease in Africans. There were 2 deaths due to EEHV2, 11-month-old and a 13-year-old. There was 1 hemorrhagic disease due to EEHV3B. That was at the Maryland Zoo, and there was a paper published about that. And that calf did survive. He was very sick, but he did survive. And then with EEHV6, there was a very mild viremia, which was the index case. And then several years ago, I don't know if I did that. There was a fatality in Thailand. An African elephant got EEHV6. So just, I have a little bit about that. Am, who's here, I think gave a talk. It was a 10-year-old zoo elephant. It died within a couple days. It didn't end up getting treated because EEHV wasn't at the top of their mind because it was an African elephant. It died after a few days, and no other herd members got sick. And then we got to this year. There were 3 deaths within about 6 weeks in February and March. African calves. The first 2 deaths, they also had bacterial co-infections, but their EEHV levels were high enough that maybe it wasn't the only cause of death, but definitely it was involved. We usually don't see survivors in Asian elephants above about 1 million per mil. And these African calves had from 3 to 11 million per mil viral genome equivalents. So definitely enough there to be causing death and disease in addition to the bacteria. Then there were 3 more calves and an adult at those same 2 zoos that had viremias afterwards. They were controlled, they did have clinical signs, got treated. So why is there this sudden spike this year? We don't know. I did put out a call for retrospective samples. I didn't know, were we missing them in the past? And it was just put down as bacterial cause of death. And I think I got maybe 5 retrospective samples. Didn't see EHV in those, but that doesn't mean we haven't missed more in the US. So the first case was at Fresno Chaffee Zoo in February, an 11-year-old elephant, which is older than we usually see in Asians. And she happened to be the index case for EHV6 when she was at Riddle's. She had a very mild viremia, or very low-level viremia, very mild clinical signs. They sent some samples, picked up a little bit, turned out it was this newly discovered EHV6. But then she got EHV3B when she went to Fresno. It was a very short illness. Callie's going to talk a little bit about the pathology in her and some of the other Africans. And then one of her herdmates also got EHV3B after her death. She had the high levels, 11 million per mil. And we found 200,000 VGEs per mil in the serum. We're not sure right now what the significance is of the levels in the serum, so we're just trying to gather a lot of data. We don't know if it's going to be something that's going to be a clue to the prognosis or not, but we are collecting that data. She did have fairly high levels in the serum. So here's a paper put out by the Thais. They also saw bacterial co-infections in a couple of Asian elephants with EHV. So just interesting that we are seeing some co-infections. We don't know how much the bacterial co-infection is affecting the EHV, which one came first. So now Callie's got some pathology.
So the reason I titled the slide Non-Fulminant African Elephants is that skin nodules and lung nodules are lesions. These animals do have a disease, it's just not a fulminant and hemorrhagic disease. So a lot of people have seen these nodules. The ones in the skin, we found herpes virus in, but also multiple herpes viruses in, but also there have been papillomaviruses that similarly cause skin nodules, and sometimes you can find both viruses in the same nodule. So hey, we're not entirely sure all of the time which virus is causing those skin nodules. And those are proliferative lesions in the skin. And then in the lung, you see these lymphofollicular follicles, which are pretty similar to what you would see as a reactive change in multiple species. And those were kind of our idea of the only thing that we really associated with herpes viruses in African elephants for a while. And then there were occasional young elephants that started to come down with the more systemic form. But the important thing is that if you have these proliferative lesions in the skin, you can detect the virus in them. Let's see, is it here? Okay, cool. Unfortunately, the clinical signs in Africans are fairly similar to the ones in Asians in that they are non-specific a lot of times when they first start. So we're looking at lethargy, abdominal pain, and colic, shaking, ataxia. Sometimes behavior changes are noted. And then at least one of the ones that we have results on, they had a leukopenia, and most of them reported some form of anorexia. So this is just a sick baby elephant, which is really unhelpful. I'm sorry for those of you who are clinical veterinarians and looking for something more useful. Again, with the hemorrhagic disease, it looks very similar. The one in Thailand was about as textbook as you could get for a hemorrhagic disease. It had the cyanotic tongue, it had the multiple bloody spots in multiple organs. So these are our classic EEHV hemorrhagic disease signs. So this is something that can affect African elephants, but it doesn't always look like that. The really important thing to note is that these guys will end up with other bacterial infections, and so Clostridial enteritis can also come up with nonspecific signs. Salmonellosis can also come up with nonspecific signs. And if you didn't know that the animal had a previous or had a concurrent infection with EEHV, you would rightly assume that these cases were dying of terrible bacterial infections and not realize that they had been predisposed to that by the fact that they had an 11 million viral count. So that's really one of the things that we are looking at closely, is to try and see, have we misattributed some of our previously assumed bacterial deaths to just a bacterial cause, and it's really multifactorial, and EEHV is playing a part, or potentially playing a part. So just to talk about some of the things that we see grossly, colonic edema and gastric ulcers, colonic ulcers, proctitis, basically inflammation in the gut. And those are things that you do see with Clostridial enteritis. You do see sometimes with salmonellosis. The fact that you could see this with EEHV is something that we haven't really considered. And we don't know if this is primarily a viral effect or whether this is the virus knocked them down and then the bacteria came in on top of it. But these are the lesions that we're seeing. Cardiovascular, these are going to look pretty similar to what you've seen in EEHV hemorrhagic disease in Asian elephants, which is going to be your epicardial and myocardial hemorrhage, your perivascular edema in multiple organs, especially the brain. So that's going to be the things that's causing the ataxia and the potential mentation changes, and then hepatic centrilobular congestion. These animals are in shock, right? Again, this is very non-specific. So could you also see that with clostridial shock? Yeah, you definitely could. So it's very important to consider when you do see something that has a smoking gun, even when you get a positive culture for a nasty salmonella, don't necessarily rule out EEHV if you think that your animal could have been exposed to it. The histological findings look very similar to other hemorrhagic diseases with the hemorrhage and edema and congestion, but virally they still do have the potential to have internuclear inclusions in those cardiomyocytes or the endothelial cells. So those are things that can be seen histologically that would tilt the pathologist towards, oh, maybe there's a herpes virus also going on in this process, but they're not in every case. So they can be really hard to find. So unfortunately, there isn't a tried and true, for sure, histological appearance of this disease in African elephants because, again, they frequently will have these super infections. So I'm going to turn it back over to Erin for diagnostic stuff.
Okay, so I'm just going to very briefly mention the Indy cases. Melissa's going to go into more detail on them. 2 cases. I only got a few samples from each because it was so quick with them. Again, they had very high levels, 2, 3, million per mil in the samples. And they each had EHV3A. So, as tragic as these deaths were, at least one thing good came out of it. Pauling at Baylor and Gary Hayward at Hopkins are doing the complete genome sequencing. They're using Naya's sample. The sequencing is done. Gary's almost finished with the annotation. So that's going to be very useful for a lot of different projects. One project is Paul is hoping to make similar serological assays for the Africans that he's already been working on in the Asians, and he'll use these sequences for that. He's also going to be working on sequencing EHV2 and 6. And once those are done, all of the 1 through 6 will be done. The only one we won't have sequenced will be EHV7, and we just don't have samples with high enough values for that. So I just want to briefly compare what it looks like in Asians and Africans. So Asian elephants, they get the 1A, 1B, 4, and 5. It tends to be the younger cats from 1 to 6. We do get some older ones, but that's the real age range, 1 to 6, 1 to 8. Trunk wash shedding and viremia are rare outside of the cases of hemorrhagic disease. And so far we haven't seen the lung and skin nodules. In Asians it's fairly different, or in Africans. They get 2, 3, 6, and 7. 2, 3, 6 have caused death and disease. 7 has only been seen in the nodules. Before this year, clinical disease was very rare in human care. Then this year, we more than doubled what we have seen. And it tends to skew older than the Asians. The recent cases, the deaths and the viremias have been in 6-year-old, 8-year-old, 11, 13. So we've had to increase the age range that we monitor. Instead of officially before it was 1 to 8 that we would monitor, but I did older ones. Now officially it's 1 to 15 that we're going to look at. And the EHVs and the gammas are often found in the lung and skin nodules. I do have some slides in a later talk with details about actual numbers of how much I've seen it in the viremia, in the blood, and in the trunk washes. So what's next? We learned a lot this year about it in Africans, but there's still a lot that we don't know. What we learned this year was in human care. We really don't know anything about what's going on in the wild. So we're hoping on Thursday, that's what we can start to flesh out. What do we need to do to figure out, is this an issue in wild elephants? Do they get HD? So, any questions?